For joining us today, Parag. To start our conversation, I'd like to ask you maybe to introduce yourself in like a minute or so.
Sure, absolutely. I'm Parag Khanna. I'm a senior fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School at the National University of Singapore. I'm also a global contributor for CNN, doing about monthly columns for them. I do a lot of teaching and lecturing at universities and do a lot of consulting work with governments on scenarios and trends and multinational corporations as well.
Great. Something the students are interested in is where do you get all the inspiration? Do you travel? Is it personal stories, anecdotes? How do you get that done?
I think the best answer is all of the above. I obviously love to travel. I was sort of born traveling, and when I do travel, I pick up a lot of insights and information, and I try to reflect what I see as I travel. In previous years, going back 10, 15 years, when I would travel, I would always seek to meet the highest ranking political authority in a given country, or a cabinet minister, or a defense minister, and things were very security focused and geopolitical focused. And over time, I learned that the most interesting people to talk to about a country's foreign policy and its international relations are often city level people, municipal figures, mayors, for example, and most certainly entrepreneurs, and that they can provide you the same insight, in fact, a lot more than the kind of high level officials. So over time, I've gravitated towards different sets of people as I travel. I have a rule: I spend as much time in a country as I need until I simply can't find anything new to say beyond what I've learned, and only then will I move on. But of course, you have to have some academic grounding. So I canvass very widely in academic and policy and popular literature when I'm researching. So, for example, for my first book, I read a lot of books about America as the continued dominant superpower in the world. I read a lot of books about how China would replace America in the 21st century, and I read a lot of books about how Europe is the standard bearer for global norms and global governance. And these three books were totally irreconcilable literatures talking about the same world in the same time period. And I thought to myself, someone has to synthesize this because they cannot all be correct. So I think you really have to do your due diligence, do your homework about the lay of the land theoretically and academically. And that's certainly very, very important as well. So I definitely get my inspirations from a range of sources for sure.
Great. In your observations, well, you've written the books and you've given a lot of very insightful advice or recommendations to leaders, large and small. And we were wondering, have you seen the impact of your books throughout your travels? From your first one, as that was a bestseller, The Second World, to the more recent one. Have you seen companies maybe implementing it or government putting in place your recommendations and seeing them actually work?
I often find that I'm reflecting the innovators, right? So in fact, I'm observing the people that are making the changes, not necessarily the people are making the changes because of what they've read in my books. But I find that when people do read them, they see a crystallization of something that they either are doing or really want to be doing. So, for example, when it comes to governments that are balancing the tricky nature of dealing with the United States, Europe, and China at the same time, and trying to maximize the benefits they get in their relations with these three powers, the trend that I picked up on was that many countries are doing this successfully at the same time, and that the United States was rather ignorant about this. The U.S. is always focused on who's our ally, who's our friend, who's with us or against us, not picking up on the subtlety of countries actually trying to be friends with everyone at the same time. Now that I've articulated that reality, I see a lot more sort of boldness around the ways in which countries are very brazen in doing this trend. And I find that, when I talk to them, they are reflecting on how they view this as a global trend because I've captured how it's happening in every corner of the world. If you look at the How to Run the World book, the focus there was so much on celebrating what I call the CEO statesman. And I talked about figures, the usual suspects, if you will, the Richard Bransons and the Bill Gates, and the kinds of people who are seamlessly balancing their public and private roles, their duties to their corporation as well as their duties to stakeholders, and their roles as public figures and leaders, even though they technically only have a certain financial fiduciary responsibility. And now I see more and more of them, and so this term CEO statesman has actually caught on a little bit, and I see more and more people aspiring to be like that. And certainly, my promotion of that and my work on kind of multi-stakeholder relations from the corporate standpoint, the diplomatic standpoint, I think has helped to push the agenda on these, because a book is not just a book, it's part of a conversation in which I'm perpetually agitating all the time, every single day with different audiences. So, I do think that the trends that I write about have been underway, otherwise I wouldn't necessarily have identified them, but, I try to do my part to nudge them forward, and I think that these trends around, of course, companies having to think very multi-stakeholder, and the trends around the diffusion of power and so forth are clearly happening.
You mentioned China, which was actually something that some of the students were particularly curious about. China is often perceived as a copy-paste society, that they struggle with innovation and are more about replicating products that come from the West. What's your take on that? And is there any particular tips that you have from a government perspective or a company perspective to the whole area of government intervention and censorship?
So I think those are two different things, or several different questions. The first is China innovative? And the answer is yes. Is China inventive in terms of pioneering and breakthrough technological discoveries and scientific discoveries? Not as much, not yet, but is investing a lot in getting there in the same way that Japan and Korea have done, and have certainly crossed that threshold. And we expect China to as well. We see what they're doing now with robotics, with lasers, with computational genetics, and so forth. China is really actually trying to become a discovery superpower as well in a range of areas. When it comes to innovation, the threshold that we set is inaccurate. I mean, the truth is that to be innovative, you simply have to use new business models and adapt technologies and products and practices to capture the highest market share. And in that sense, China is absolutely supremely innovative. And you can see that in the ways in which they've actually moved up the value chain and captured market share in electronics, technology, and a whole host of areas. Some of it may not seem like it's based on free market principles, but that is not the measure of whether or not something is innovative. The measure is, did you capture market share by adapting business practices and adapting technologies from wherever you find them? That is the definition. And have you done so in a way that reduces costs and therefore creates more value for your customers in the marketplace? And again, the answer is China has been extraordinarily innovative. Now we're looking at, if you look at areas like solar power, for example, clean energy, and some of these technology areas, they've done a lot to bring down the cost of technology, to advance scale, to push these out into rural areas where they haven't been used before. So China has been quite innovative in that regard as well. So I think we, on the whole, need a much more sophisticated approach to whether or not, China is innovative. One of these areas where this comes to a head is your second question around technology. We've seen with Alibaba or Huawei or Baidu or Xiaomi, both in hardware and software, and e-commerce, we have seen a lot of innovation in China. They've moved up the value chain and captured huge market share, and companies like Alibaba should not be mistaken as simply copy-paste of Amazon. They're actually hybrids of Amazon, eBay, and many other types of online marketplace innovations, and they combine them all in a truly unique way. There is only one Alibaba, and it is a Chinese company, not an American company. So I think we absolutely have to appreciate that is a very innovative way in which they've gone about expanding their offerings and doing so in the context of the Chinese economy, Chinese consumers, and Chinese businesses. So, we will find more and more cases in which we have to concede that China is not just copy-paste rather than less.
So China is innovative. Is it a good friend? And what I mean by this, you've argued a lot for the concept of mega diplomacies and for the peaceful coexistence of very different forms of pretty much governments and empires and militaries and so on. Do you think that there are any countries that may jeopardize the possibility of implementing mega diplomacy globally?
Mega diplomacy rests on a thematic understanding around focusing on issues and then determining who the best actors are to get involved in them. It's not about whether or not the permanent 5 members of the Security Council agree on it or not agree on it, right? So the key is that you get around the issue of whether or not one country is blocking something or not blocking something. My view is that there's plenty of mega diplomacy going on in China. It's happening every day. It's happening with the push for raising wages in Chinese factories and on foreign factories in China, such as Walmart. It's happening with the technology integration that's going on through Chinese companies. It's going on with NGOs that are reducing carbon emissions in cities and improving conservation and reducing pollution. If you are a European NGO or a European company that excels in recycling technologies and clean energy, the door is wide open to you in China. You are part of the mega diplomacy around the issue of reducing emissions in China. So China is a hotbed, in fact, for the roles of many different actors. Are certain NGOs being circumscribed and shut down and kicked out of the country? Yes. Is it becoming more difficult for foreign businesses to be profitable in China against local competition? Yes. But you have to take it issue by issue to understand. China is also a big contributor to mega diplomacy. Remember that China's role as a trading power, China is now the largest importer or export destination for about 124 countries, which is twice as many as the number of countries for whom the U.S. Is the number one trade partner. That means that in a very matter-of-fact way, Chinese consumption, whether it is Chinese consumers or whether it's the commodity sector, whether it's state-owned enterprises, are a very big agent of development in foreign countries. Chinese companies, both public and private, are actually now at the forefront of creating jobs in Africa because they've been offshoring their own factories in areas like textiles, for example, and light manufacturing, because labor costs are much cheaper in Southeast Asia and in Africa. So those are Chinese corporations playing a role on the issue of how do we do infrastructure and job creation and skill building and economic growth and boosting the export sector in Africa. So if Africa was a global developmental issue, there's many Chinese players that are part of the mega diplomacy on the issue of African development. So there's not a single issue in the world where China, the state, and China, the companies, and so forth, are not critical players, in the same way that there's not a single issue where the American government and American corporations are not critical players. So mega diplomacy is alive and well, whether or not you have internet censorship or whether or not you have industrial competition.
Okay, thank you. So, trying to bring this back to us as students, what does this mean for us? What would be the main takeaways? What are the key tips that we should consider when we join a new company, when we join a new environment? How should we look at it differently because of your insights?
Well, I work broadly in the field of globalization. And my thesis is that globalization is not only alive and well, but is entering a new golden age. And that seems counterintuitive from the American standpoint. When you're watching CNBC or listening to growth forecasts from Wall Street, you have a lot of pessimism because people believe that globalization is slowing or the rate of growth in American trade is slowing and so forth. But the fact is that globalization is global. You don't measure it from the standpoint of New York City or from Wall Street or from London. You measure it in terms of the aggregate growth in the density of relations across all continents in the world. And the relations between the trade and FDI relations between China and Africa have grown by 1,800% since the year 2002. That's not a small amount. That's not the single digits that people on Wall Street worry about. That's quadruple digit growth. And you see the same pattern playing out across other regions. So my advice to graduates, whether it's MBA programs or otherwise, is to follow the flows. If I could put it in 3 words, follow the flows. It's not about whether you're optimistic or pessimistic. At any given time, there's an enormous volume of transactions and business and relations going on between any 2 nodes in the system, whether it's in Latin America or in Africa, whether it's e-commerce companies or whether it's industrial companies. You need to go where those flows are and be part of those flows. You cannot sit and let it come to you. And that's why being in a global program, a global student body, and a global network, and making global connections is extremely important because, as you well know, most people will have 8 or 9 jobs over their course of their career, not just 1 or 2. So you need to be prepared to work in different sectors and be in different places at any given time.
So while we look at our future, or we would like maybe a preview. Is there a new interesting project or a new book that you're working on right now that you could share some with us?
Yes, I can. I mean, I have a book coming out in April. It's actually called Connectography, Mapping the Future of Global Civilization. And it's sort of a reorganization of world politics and economics built not around nations and states and borders, but around infrastructure and connectivity and supply chains. So I look at global transportation networks, energy networks, and of course communications networks, and I map them out around the world, and I demonstrate that we are already, this is not a futuristic book, this is today, we've already become what I call an urban network civilization. We are really, well, only on the political maps on our walls are we neatly divided into states and countries and borders and so forth. In fact, the way the world actually works today, every minute, is that we are a increasingly dense lattice or network of relations of many kinds amongst major population centers, which are cities. So that's really what that's what the book is arguing, and I demonstrate it by looking at commercial patterns and migration and cyberspace and so forth.
That's exciting and a lot of very relevant topics that hopefully the students will have the chance to look into. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
And thank you for taking the time. I'm sure that we can learn a lot from your experience, the way you've approached writing these books and coming up with these insights. And if not by directly traveling, at least here at Hult with having someone from totally different hemispheres and continents sitting right next to each other, we can learn by actually exposure to them.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Look forward to next time.
Likewise.